Thank you, Mike.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SADC TFCA webinar series for the year 2026. As you might be aware, we've been having these webinars, I think, since last year. This one is the third in the series from the time that we commenced, that with a focus on DRR, and it's basically disaster risk reduction in the Trans-Frontier Conservation area. Our theme is building landscape resilience in the Southern Africa TFCA and RBO. RBOs is River Basin Organizations, for those of you that might not be aware. And we are looking at the lessons that have been learned with a major focus on the Limpopo Basin. The other two series on DRR were basically talking about, measures that have been put in place. Today, we have a special focus on looking at the actual activities and how our colleagues and resource persons in the Limpopo Basin and GLTFCA have been coping in terms of the floods as well. As you might be aware, we have had floods in the Limpopo Basin this rainy season. I will be your moderator. My name is Beauty Shamboko Mbale. I am part of the GIZ SADC team with a focus on transboundary water management. We also have with us our interpreters, Eve Manda and Romain Mwenya, that will be doing the French interpretation. So those of you that would a bit more familiar with the French, please click on the French under the languages section. We have Caillou and Romao that will be doing the Portuguese interpretation. Our program was ideally supposed to have started with the welcoming remarks from Madam Nana Dlamini. She will, I think there's an echo. I think she will catch up with us. So we will, I think, just go straight ahead with a presentation from Dr. Eddie Riddle. There's someone whose mic is unmuted. May you please mute your mic? And then we will have a presentation from the TFCA side from Dr. Tertia Stridom. And then we Hello, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, ma'am. We can hear you perfectly.
Okay, there seems to be an echo. I hope it's not my phone or anything. Tech. And then we will look at the launch of the DRM RID online training short course. I think without further ado, let me already allow Eddie to start his presentation.
Thanks very much, Beauty. Just confirming you can hear me. Just while I load up.
We can hear you, Eddie.
Great, thanks. And just confirming you can see the slides.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thanks again, Beauty, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for the opportunity I'm Eddie Riddell. I'm the regional coordinator with the Limpopo Watercourse Commission. So, as Beauty mentioned, and I think as you're all aware, the Limpopo River Basin is often subject to floods, but in this particular year, 2026, started with a bang and had some quite exceptional flooding conditions. So, what I want to do is just give you an overview of a little bit of the institutional alignment that we work on as the Limpopo Watercourse Commission at a regional level, how our flood early warning systems are designed and operated, the context to this year's flood event, and some of the institutional dynamics that we coordinate within the Limcom Secretariat with our partners, some of the impacts at River Basin level and the current status, and then just some key learnings that speak to the issues that we're working at a regional level through the various SADC directorates, RBOs, TFCAs, disaster risk reduction units, etc. I do advise that I have used some photos, and because it was a very busy period, tried my best to attribute to the correct person, but it might not be 100% correct. And yeah, also in the era of AI, using some tools just to create some slides. So yeah, this is the institutional context for the attendees. This is the Limpopo River Basin, which is the main river basin you can see outlined there in purple. And the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area actually sits within the middle reaches of the basin, but also then straddles the Bapusacom Basin in the north and the Inco Maputo Basin in the south. And just a little bit of institutional background. As a river basin organization, we are a SADC mandated institution. We are one of 13 river basin organizations in the region. And our mandate is really to improve transboundary cooperation, both for the stakeholders in the river system, but the ecosystem, and as part of the sustainable development trajectory for the region. In our case, as Limcom, we have various structures that help us with our day-to-day work. And different RBOs have slightly different structures, but in our case, we have a technical overarching task team. These are the engineers and water resource planners. We have a legal task team, which focuses on the legal component, the transboundary agreements and so forth. We have a particular focus on groundwater in the Limpopo River Basin. We've just established an environmental task team over the past 2 years, which have been successfully deployed. And of course, we have a flood forecasting task team, because one of the Limcom's key thematic areas is around resilience building in the basin. So droughts also feature, but more often than not, the focus is operational aspects around flood early warning. This is a slide I often present, so apologies those who've seen this several times, but essentially what we're trying to do at a SADC level is work to build efficiencies, integrate our operations at a regional level with our partners. And what this slide shows is the different SADC level policies. So we have the Regional Strategic Action Plan on Water and the SADC TFCA program. On the left-hand side, those are the ones from 10 years ago. And then on the right-hand side, these are the more recent updates. And in both cases, we're seeing a stronger alignment or an area of complementarity where the TFCAs and the RBOs are joining forces in some way in terms of areas of mutual benefit and efficiencies. And I think what you'll come to realize during the series of talks this afternoon is really where the disaster risk response strategy for SADC can really help galvanize a lot of this work, and vice versa, where the RBOs and the TFCAs can assist in the SADC disaster response strategy implementation. So in our case, in the Limpopo Basin, over the past few years, with support of USAID and more recently GIZ, focusing on cooperation between the Great Limpopo TFCA and its partners, so the 3 parks that make up the Great Limpopo, Kruger, Limpopo National Park, and Gonarezo. And a lot of the focus has really been around the sustainability of river freshwater management of the ecosystems, wetlands, environmental flows for rivers, and of course, there's an element of disaster risk reduction and early warning that is becoming more and more prominent under climate change. This slide basically shows you what we deal with often in the Limpopo. This is a basin that's quite susceptible to cyclones. And I mean, this is often in the news, but if we start with the most prominent, the year 2000 cyclone Helene was a very a famous example of a cyclone impact in the system. More recently, 2012, Cyclone Dando was an exceptional impact in the Olifants subcatchment, and then more recently, Cyclone Eloise and so forth. So our early warning systems are designed to provide that forecasting in terms of impact for these climatic events. In our case as Limcom, we have a well-designed flood forecasting early warning system. It uses a combination of a hydrological and hydraulic model which is an open source hydrology package, and primarily uses these gauging weirs. Let me just put the laser pointer there so you can see. So the three key gauges for us in the Limpopo is starting up on the Botswana-South Africa border at Sterkloot, and moving down towards Beitbridge. So the Beitbridge gauge between South Africa and Zimbabwe is the key one to provide the early warning down to Mozambique, as well as the Bululi gauge in the Kruger National Park just before it flows into the Massingier Dam. So all of these gauges are operated by the national departments, and here's just a map to show you a little bit more orientation around where the TFCAs sit. But I also want to make mention to the Greater Mapungubwe TFCA, because in the Limpopo, this is a key node between Botswana, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. Also provides early warning to the downstream users and the TFCAs. Impact zones, just to keep an eye out as we go through the talk, is particularly downstream in Mozambique, the Chokwe area downstream of Massingier Dam towards Shai. But just coming back to the gauging, this is the flows at Beitbridge. This is probably the most prominent gauge that we use in our flood early warning. And again, coming back to the point of where the TFCAs play real value in our basin, Mapungubwe is the area where the Shashe River coming in from Botswana and Zimbabwe joins the main stem of the Limpopo River at South Africa's border. And then those combined flows are met at Beitbridge. What we typically see in most seasons is this kind of dual peak process close together. So within 1, 2 or 3 days, we'll get 2 flood peaks. And that will inform us how we manage or forecast what will happen downstream towards the floodplain in Mozambique. And so this is typical. So usually one would see a flush coming in from the Shashe, followed via the Limpopo, or vice versa. But currently, Limcom is implementing a global environment facility project with UNDP and the Global Water Partnership. And we're about 3.5 years into this program. And one of the key aspects of this project is to strengthen the flood forecasting and early warning system. And in this case, we worked with the national departments in our flood forecasting task team to fill some key blind spots, some critical gaps. And I just want to highlight, amongst several others, we put around 12 stations to supplement the national monitoring throughout the basin. But in terms of the TFCA links, they're quite critical for us in terms of the Great Limpopo. So the South African Department of Water Affairs co-funded the initiative and put a radar system on the high water bridge on the Shingwetsi River in KNP. We also then put in a gauge on the Mwenetsi River at Malapati and Gonarozo National Park, Zimbabwe, and also at Mapai on the Limpopo main stem in Limpopo National Park in Mozambique. And then basically we're using these systems to take sight of the climatic forecast, cyclones or otherwise in the Southwest Indian Ocean. And then our task team will evaluate both pre-season, looking at the likelihood of cyclonic events, and then post-season, looking at the impact, how many cyclones or tropical storms, and what was the impact, and did our observation systems perform as they should during each system. Okay, so moving on. So some of us got back to work a little bit early this year, and already things were heating up in terms of the atmospheric conditions. And I think one of the first points that we picked up around the 7th of January, there was a real social media buzz that was being picked up on these weather apps we have on our phones and our desktops, which created quite a frenzy. I myself was getting numerous calls the day I got back to work, and WhatsApp messages and all kinds of things with this particular message, which was forecasting that the week ahead was going to experience close to 1,000 millimeters of rainfall. Our first impressions was like, well, this is exceptional. But of course, we then related back to our disaster management centers in the countries for an updated assessment. They in turn reviewed that data. They gave it a very good evaluation. They did point out that the social media process was leading to a little bit of a hoax, But they did caution that they were aware that there's a big system coming. They just couldn't determine the full magnitude and intensity of that event. However, it did point out that it wasn't a cyclonic event, as we typically characterize as flood conditions in the basin. But it also was coming off the back of a very wet December. So, for example, in northern Kruger Park in Pafuri, they had about 300 millimeters in one day in mid-December, which just gives you an idea of the saturation of the catchment already. And it was at that point when these messages were going through that there was an alignment between the work of our flood forecasting team as well as the GLTFCA, and we started to coordinate closely together in terms of monitoring and looking at potential impacts. This is the rainfall that actually arrived. So you can see it's actually not that far different from what was forecasted by the apps. So just a word of caution is maybe we should believe a little bit by the apps, but basically wait for that verification from our national weather services. Okay, this is actually the impact itself, and hopefully you can see that the video playing as well. But basically what happened is, from around the 6th or 7th of January, a tropical low pressure moved into the very south of the Mozambique Channel and moved inland into the subcontinent. Typically, these events will move their way up the Limpopo Valley all the way up to Botswana and Zimbabwe. But in this case, this system got stuck. And it basically stuck around for 10 days or so and just continually drew moisture in, both from the southern Indian Ocean as well as from the interior, from sort of Zambia, Zimbabwe, northern Namibia area through the ITCZ. So it continually managed to draw in more and more moisture, and it wouldn't dislodge. The early parts of the forecast thought that there was going to be a high pressure system in the Southern Cape that would dislodge the system, and that didn't happen. The system intensified, but not to a cyclone level. But you can see on the bottom right-hand side, the weather services put out severe weather warnings once they got a better handle on the forecasted intensities. And this is where all the entities started to put in response and mitigation measures. So where it really happened, the rain started to fall in the catchment area quite heavily around the 10th of January, but went into a very intense phase, 14th to 15th of January. The Luvuvu and the Shingwetsi and the Mwenetsi system in Zimbabwe had already responded to those earlier rains following the 10th of January. But what we saw was an exceptional load of rain around the 14th of January, several hundred of millimeters within a 24-hour period. And the important thing to recognize here is something that we call in hydrology, it's the time of concentration. So basically, once the rainfall starts, how long does it take for the river to respond? And in our case, it was several hours, which we're usually dealing with tens of hours and days. It was an exceptionally intense rain that by the time we woke up in the morning and reconnected at our disaster management consultations, the Letaba River and the Olifants River were already breaking their banks in the Kruger Park and heading downstream towards Mozambique. One of the key gauges, and I think Dr. Tersch will touch on this as well, is the Black Heron Weir. This is the Mahlangean section in the western boundary of Kruger. You may have heard of the Mboula village, which neighbors this area. That's the one that got washed away. This weir basically got damaged, and you can see this is part of our Limcom communications on WhatsApp. The head of water in the river rose above 10 meters, which means that the pressure transducers that our gauges are designed for failed because simply the pressure broke the probe, which means we have to now start thinking around designing back better for these new climatic events that we're starting to see. And this happened across all the main river systems that flow across the Kruger Park downstream into Mozambique. This gives you a bit of a hydrograph representation of what happened. So we're looking primarily at the Letaba and the Olifants River, both of which flow downstream into the Masinje Dam before then flowing further downstream into the Limpopo in Mozambique. In both cases, the flow was very rapid. It rose above the calibrated head that we usually gauge flood observations. So these figures, you see 9,000 for Letaba and 3,500 for the Olifants, was actually way above. These are the calibrated levels that one can monitor. And then you've probably seen some social media feeds where the high water bridge and the Baluli overtopped and so forth. And very exceptional, low time of concentration floodwaters moved downstream towards Mozambique. And this is basically what happened. This is the conceptual hydrology of the Masinje Dam. The Messenger Dam, for those that aren't aware, was upgraded around 10 years ago with a third spillway, which is called the auxiliary spillway, which is designed to release 22,000 cubic meters per second. When I've spoken to my colleagues that are involved in this upgrade, they actually didn't think they'd ever need to use this auxiliary spillway. They agreed to do it at great expense. But here we can see that under those exceptional conditions, 22,000 cubics was being passed through the Messenger Dam during the 14th and 15th of January, which is probably likely exceeds the very high flows we already saw under Cyclone Dando in 2012. This video, you'll see this is the auxiliary spillway early on in the event, and there's later on. And then further downstream, just downstream, you'll see there's a big scour that was scoured out as a result of these exceptional flows. So it's quite a monumental event, and a lot of people, as mentioned, never thought they'd ever have to use this spillway at all. So just to summarize, in terms of the event, we saw a massive catalyst in terms of the system continually growing, effectively bringing more and more moisture. We saw hydrological responses that were probably in excess of recent flood conditions that we've had over the past 20 or 30 years. And as I told, the infrastructure took a hammering, both in terms of our observations and, of course, the tourism infrastructure and human infrastructure throughout the middle part of the basin. And of course, we used real-time communication, especially social media, just to make sure our communication was rapid across the different sectors and the stakeholders we work with. As mentioned, the probes were damaged, and there's an assessment that's just been undertaken by the national departments to go and assess these gauges now that they are starting to become accessible from road access. But importantly, what we do now realize, and we're learning over the past few years, is we need real-time verification from those on the ground. So this, just to emphasize the point, in TFCAs, where we have the rangers and scientists on the ground, it becomes incredibly important for verification. And in our case, we were fortunate we had helicopter flights from the Kruger Park and so forth flying around as well. And they're also able to give us visual verification of some of the information. There's also some misinformation that unfortunately comes out. This is an example that was actually on the South African news on the 15th, on the afternoon of the 15th, which reported that the Makaratane Dam on the Limpopo had been damaged. In fact, that picture is pointing to the Messenger Dam. And that block you see floating downstream is actually designed to disengage from that structure in order to create further releases of water out of the system. So there's a little bit of miscommunication we need to retranslate with stakeholders in terms of understanding the real impact, just to point that out. And of course, these very excitable events do tend to generate a lot of misinformation, but this is quite an important one. Yeah, okay, so actually getting to the impacts on the ground, and in terms of how the response worked. So when we're talking early warning, we're typically talking sort of 4 key processes: forecasting, communication, interpretation, and response. And I think in our case, we could see that the real-time communication was working. The systems from the impact-based forecast from weather services went out, but perhaps the response time on the ground and the local level decision-making was a little bit lacking. We do know that our head of ministry in Mozambique went on national TV a few days in advance, and the disaster management teams in the respective countries then took control of coordinating. But I think what we also need to identify is the fact that the hydrological conditions under this event were so exceptional in terms of the rainfall intensities that even then they may not have had adequate time to prepare. And so it's something we have to think about in terms of anticipatory response and dealing with these new extreme rainfall events and our exceedingly short time of concentration we're now dealing with. And then just to highlight the key aspects of partnerships, I do want to elevate the fact that our colleagues in the Kruger Park and Peace Parks Foundation in Limpopo National Park were very helpful on the ground, getting immediate relief, working with the institutions, getting relief across borders, particularly for some very isolated communities along the main stem of the Limpopo River. And so that really must be commended. And those on the call that helped with that, yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so where are we now? This is just some satellite images. So looking around mid-December, this is This is the Massanger Dam here, and the Limpopo comes down in the massive floodplain all the way down to Shai. This is Chokwe here, and coincidentally, the Nkomati River Basin comes up here, flows past the Kurumana Dam, and flows down close and enters the Indian Ocean close to Maputo. What you'll see is after the floods, the whole floodplain was fully saturated, almost all the way up to the Massanger Dam, and in all intents and purposes, the Limpopo and the Nkomati system were hydraulically connected at that point. We started to see a slight drying out of the system. This was early February, and sort of reterrestrialization and subsidence of water in those estuaries as we speak. This image from earlier this week. Okay, in terms of the actual current status, and I'm reporting more on the Mozambique side at this stage, but of course the impact was of course felt on the South African side in Mopani district and Vembe district. But in Mozambique, close to 1 million people, 750,000 people were immediately affected, requiring housing, food aids. I think in terms of the immediate impact, it was access to food and wash services. As mentioned, there was a window of around a week to 10 days where resources were starting to flow in, and the partners in the GLTFCA were critical to be part of that process, working with the Disaster Management Institute. But I think we're also relieved to see how quickly resources were mobilized through SADC and through the government ministries to get to that development aid for post-flood rehabilitation and development. I think the key thing now is the fact that we've lost hundreds of thousands of hectares of arable land and heads of livestock. So in terms of the medium-term response, this is what we're thinking programmatically in terms of resourcing to get those livelihoods back on track. Fortunately, people are starting to return home. We know that in Gaza province, the schools are about to reopen and people have been temporarily relocated and starting to move home. But of course, the infrastructure cost is still massive. I think the current estimate is around almost $1 billion on the Mozambique side. And then from our side, from a coordinating body, from a water management institution perspective, we'll be doing our best to support on the water resource management guidance in that respect. Just want to highlight this as well. This is a key event that happened. This is the Letaba River. Not only did it damage the gauges upstream, it damaged the Engelhard Weir, which exits Kruger and then goes into Mozambique, joins the Olifants. What it's done is had a good ecological outcome in the sense that it's restored the ecological connectivity, but it's damaged the gauge. We now have to think very comprehensively and cohesively with all the role players when it comes to early warning around how we improve the monitoring system. What alternatives do we now put in place? Do we use bridges and radar systems instead of the old hydraulic infrastructure? And we're looking forward to a site visit to undertake that assessment very soon. So key learnings, just to move to closure. I think it's become clear that we have new realities. Climate change is definitely here. I don't think we can deny that. I think we're seeing exceptionally localized rainfall intensities, which we've never seen. What I would say is that we had kind of similar circumstances in the Nkomati Basin in 2023 with very intense localized rainfalls, but perhaps not felt at the river basin level. So we're definitely seeing a change in the meteorological processes and how that impact on our flood forecasting ability. As mentioned, we need to design back better and reassess our hydrometric network together with the partners, both within the water sector, the environment sector, disaster risk reduction sector, and other partners. I can't stress this more. You know, the social networks that we've built up over the past few years with the advent of technology have really helped. Of course, misinformation can get out there, but I think it's the role of our institutions to manage that. They're absolutely critical. They get that information out there and help us manage. I think we've also got some learnings for Limcom. Our colleagues up in Bapusa, between Zimbabwe and the Buzi-Pungwe Save, actually had a similar set of circumstances a few years ago and put in siren systems for early warning to very remote communities. This is maybe something we need to think about for the TFCA related communities in our basin in Limpopo. I would also like to re-emphasize the point that these new impact-based forecasting alerts that go out by our national weather services are actually really helping. It helps us plan. As mentioned, we had a joint cooperation with the GLTFCA. Anticipating what was coming helps, even though we don't know the full magnitude. It definitely helps us be more proactive. So that's a real advantage we have currently. And I think, as to mention, it's now how we join these forces to implement the SADC disaster response strategy and improve our reaction window, both in terms of monitoring, getting the aid in quickly, and so forth. And as I've been dealing with some of our development partners over the past few weeks, this sort of anticipatory action is becoming a very prominent discussion. We can't keep putting aid in to deal with the problem. It's about how we design back better, how we design the disaster risk reduction as part of the development trajectory for our river basins and our stakeholders. So this last slide is basically a sort of institutional cooperation mind map. If we envisage a perfect world, this is how we would be working seamlessly across our regional institutions, with our task teams, working with our protected areas, working with our other ministries. And I think elements of this are working, but I think it gives us an idea of where we need to be heading to and bring in the new tools at our disposal, especially for downscale flood forecasting that is really key for us. Yeah, so just to highlight the fact there was a good level of coordination. Of course, it can be improved. And I think really now we need to be moving to align these three strategies more cohesively and welcome task teams to establish that and take this forward. I'd just like to thank our partners who are involved in this process. Yeah, quite an array, but we really appreciate all the efforts. Thanks very much, Program Director. Back to you, Beauty.
Thank you so much, Eddie. A very clear account of what happened, and commendations to you and everyone that was on the ground during this particularly difficult time. So Dr. Eddie Riddle is the regional coordinator for the Limpopo Basin GEF project, and has been giving the perspective from the river basin or the hydrological aspect. We will move to Dr. Tertia Stridom to give us the perspective from, I think, the TFCA side. But also just to reiterate Onkemetse's comment in the chat, please put your questions in the chat so that you do not lose your train of thought as we hear from Dr. Tertia. Over to you, Tertia.
Thank you so much.
Before Tertia gets in, sorry, Beauty, there seemed to be another link running on the team's side, and they can only hear the voices. They are not seeing the presentations. So I just wanted to alert them that we have shared the Zoom link within the team's chat. Please just join the Zoom link so that then you can really appreciate the presentations on top of the voices that you can hear. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Tertia, over to you.
You can just let me know when you see my slides.
Okay, now we can see them.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to give some perspective from Kruger Park. I've been working in the park for the last 15 or so years with a bit of a hydrology background. And I think Eddie gave a nice overview of what happened across the basin. So I'm going to just narrow that down to what happened in Kruger specifically, keeping in mind that the park covers two basins. It has the Limpopo in the north and then Inkomati in the south. And, at some point, both from the north, Limpopo River, all the way down to the Crocodile River in the south, we were dealing with this flooding impacts across the whole park. So just for a bit of context, so Kruger National Park, so we're one of the largest national parks in the country, managed by South African National Parks. Let me just put my laser on as well. And we form part of the Great Limpopo TFCA. And Kruger, as you guys know, we're a conservation and tourism entity, but our ecosystem is considered water limited. And like fire and herbivory, these are very important drivers that control the way in which ecosystem functions and the patterns we see across the landscape. What is interesting about Kruger and Mozambique as well is that we are downstream of several major river catchments. So it makes us vulnerable to extreme rainfall both outside the park, further up in the catchments, up to the west, as well as rainfall that falls inside the park. And we know that these flows ultimately drains towards Mozambique, which is even more susceptible to catastrophic flooding impacts. So if you look just within Kruger, we have an extensive network of drainage lines in the park. So these are streams, rivers, all drainage lines. And they are thousands of kilometers long. They're roughly 30,000 kilometers. If you just look on the map on the right, on the western side of the park, on the granites, we have a higher density of these drainage lines and streams compared to the basalts on the eastern part of the park. So if you go into pre-floods, all our warnings and evacuations, so this low pressure system, like Eddie mentioned, hovered above the low veld for more than a week. And what ultimately happened is that we ended up having daily warnings of extreme rainfall from South African weather services that started already that weekend of the 11th of Jan. And as a precaution, because of that, it was then decided that the camps in the northern part of the park would be closed and evacuated as a precautionary approach. So basically, a number of the camps, particularly the bush camps, so these remote camps, were evacuated from the Limpopo River down towards the Olifants River. The bigger camps like Mopani, Olifants, these are elevated camps, so there was no particular risk foreseen for them. But the other camps, particularly along the Shingwetsi River, the Olifants River, and the Letaba, was evacuated. Except the Letaba Risk Camp also was considered still safe at that point because it was also elevated. And then on the 15th and the 16th of January, we had this unprecedented level 10 warning that was issued for Kruger. So you can see the top figure there on the right. And we've never had level 10 warnings before. That's 10 out of 10. So that was pretty unprecedented. The image on the bottom was just an example of we used a combination of technology during that time. So we had the warnings by weather service, but we also had access to radar imagery that we could see rainfall events happening up in the catchments, somewhat in real time. It was about maybe a 2 or 3 hour delay, but we could see already where within our catchment areas there was extreme rainfall that was falling, and that definitely helped us prepare for what was on its way downstream. And then I'm going to go a bit into during the flood. So in terms of the rainfall, so more than half of the park's ranger stations, we have 23 of those. 12 of them measured more rainfall during the single month of January compared to its mean annual rainfall. So, for example, Punda has a mean annual rainfall of 531 millimeters for the year, but during January, we measured 750 mils. Keeping in mind, like Eddie mentioned, there was already a very wet December period that we had. So the ground was already pretty saturated before we had to deal with this low pressure system. In Palabora, mean annual rainfall is around 500 millimeters, but we measured 709 millimeters in January alone. And interestingly, 90% of that 700 plus mils fell within just 8 days. So that was 642 mils between the 11th and the 18th of January in Palabora. Just to give you some of the idea of the intensity of rainfall we were dealing with within that 8 to 10 day period. Satara, there was one day where Satara had also over, I think it was around 108 millimeters of rain in 24 hours as well. And that's what caused flooding of our staff accommodation along a stream that most people do not even pay attention to because it's really one of those like second order type streams, very, very narrow, shallow streams. But yeah, in this case, it caused significant flooding in the camp. And then in terms of the river responses, so I'm just focusing on 3 of the major rivers in the north, where we have some discharge information. So for example, I'll start in the north in Shingwetsi. Silverfish weir pre-flood. So this is about a day or two before the low pressure system hit us. So you're looking at like 1 cubic of water along the Shingwetsi River at this point, 20 centimeters height of water. But during the actual event, that peaked at least, because this still needs to be verified, because at a lot of the times these rating tables were exceeded. So these are minimums. 1,287 cumecs, roughly 3 meters of water at the Chinguetti, just as it basically enters the park on the western boundary. And if you compare that to the floods of 2013, for example, it is way more than that. And 2013, sorry, was when the Chinguetti camp flooded, which didn't happen this year. Then, in terms of the Letaba, Black Heron at Mahlangeni is just where the Groot and the Klein Letaba meets as it enters Kruger National Park. And before the flooding event, you had about between 30, 50 cumecs of water, less than a meter height of water. And then what happened is we got up to at least 13 meters of water at Black Heron. There's no historical data for flooding events at Black Heron, unfortunately. But in terms of Engelhard, also we're dealing with less than a meter of water before the flooding event. And then during the peak flooding event, we had at least 9 meters of water, more than 9,000 cumecs. Once again, also minimum, because this was the point at which the instruments then couldn't cope anymore. They then broke, and also the wall had then washed away, so it breached. So we also estimate that to be a lot more. And compared to the 2000 floods, compared to the 2013 floods, this far exceeds what we saw historically. So this is, the biggest flood on record currently for the Letaba at Engelhard. Then for the olifants, Mamba Weir, just as the olifant enters the park at Valaborwa, and Balule, which is further down the river near Olifants Camp, we were looking at around 200 to 250 cumecs, 1.3 meters height of water before the flood. And then when the actual flood happened, we got more than 3,600 cumecs of water, nearly 6 meters height in water before the loggers had also failed. Similar in Balule as well. The instruments ended up failing. There are estimates at Balule based on some colleagues of ours that went to the field that estimate that it could have been easily 8 meters of water. So we, alongside DWS, etc., we wanting to go and verify these readings to get the final values. But once again, obviously, access to these areas are still pretty difficult, as a lot of the roads, etc., have washed away. This is just a hydrograph, giving an example of what happened at Engelhard. And as you can see, those couple of days before the flood, was normal summer flows that you would see along the Letaba River. Then we got an initial peak come through, and the rangers on the ground, everyone was monitoring it, so you could see it coming up. And then came the massive peak in the morning of the 15th of January. And interestingly enough, which speaks to the value of social media, that night before was when we saw videos and imagery from communities to the western side of the park that started reporting flooded rivers and bridges, etc. So you could see this water coming in from up in the catchment because you would see this on social media. So that really helped anticipate what was on its way. And then also the fact that there are gauging stations operated by the Department of Water and Sanitation higher up in the catchment, that we could keep an eye on what is happening in those rivers upstream and anticipating what was on its way downstream. What's quite interesting with speaking to that time of concentration that Eddie mentioned, with the Letaba specifically, we picked up a surge coming into the park at Mahlangeni at Black Heron in the morning. And then within an hour, which is about 50 kilometers away downstream, within an hour, that peak had reached Engelhard Dam at Letaba. So that just shows how quickly that volume of water had moved about 50 kilometers away. It literally took an hour between the two peaks that were detected between Mahlangeni and Letaba. So here's just some pictures. The flooding impacts, as I mentioned, started in the far north around Pafuri, but within 3 days, the impacts were widespread all the way down to the south of the park in the Inkomati catchment as well. So we were literally trying to manage a flood from north to south, east to west, over 2 million hectares of Kruger. This picture over here on the top left, this was our main tar road, our main arterial that connects the central part of the park to the far north. That was cut off for a few days. And what this meant is that a number of camps, although they were elevated and safe, they were cut off from access, right? And then besides damage to infrastructure like maybe electricity or water supply, there are supplies for food, for fuel, etc., that a lot of the camps then had to also deal with for a couple of days. This is some of the damage to that road. After the waters would subside a bit, you end up seeing the damage to the tar road. Bottom left, this is one of those streams that come up very, very quickly and drop also very quickly. But what would happen is tourists would drive through in the morning, go on their game drive, and then on the way back would find themselves stuck because of a flooded bridge or road that suddenly came up. And then the bottom right, this is Sable High near Palabora, which is at the dam. So tourists enjoy this type of overnight facilities, but it was completely flooded. Of course, Sable Dam was closed in that precautionary approach that we took because we were anticipating all this rain, so we did close it. There were no guests there at the time. But this just shows how widespread these impacts were. And then again, this was the risk, the staff facilities in and around Sataro with that little tiny stream that I mentioned that you barely even pay attention to, but it got completely saturated because of that amount of more than 100 mils falling within 24 hours after days of saturation. This is just an image of the Letaba rest camp for those that do know the restaurant along the Letaba. Obviously, it got much higher than this because this was a photo taken when people could still, walk there and access it. This picture on the top over here was the Crocodile River that got cut off, and which is the southern boundary of the park. And this also just speaks to the other complication that comes with flooding events. Although people were safe and there was no loss of life, which we are very, very grateful for, considering the impact the flood has had outside the park in terms of the loss of life, both in South Africa, Mozambique, in Zim. We know it was completely devastating. With this particular bridge in Crocodile Bridge, we would have tourists into the park for a day visit, right? And they expect to be able to drive back outside the park where the accommodation is. And then the river comes up to this magnitude during the day while they are stuck inside the park with just the clothes on their back, no plans to have stayed overnight, and then they end up being stuck in the park for up to a week. We had some cases where there were people that came in that we had one guest that was on chronic medication that needed their medication. So in that case, people would need to be evacuated to be able to be taken back out to the park because they never anticipated that they would be stuck here for a week because they only expected to come in for a few hours. Once again, this is some of the staff accommodation completely flooded in Satara. Bottom right is Shimuweni Bush Camp, which luckily we did evacuate, anticipating these floods a couple of days before they actually happened. But there's also substantial damage to this camp. And then these bottom two on the left, these are, you would have maybe seen these pictures already. These are from Letaba Rest Camp that was flooded. And these photos were shared quite widely across social media. And then, we talk quite a bit about the flooding impacts, but from an ecological perspective, flooding events have happened for a long time on geological scales. They're happening way more frequently these days because of climate change. But, if you look at how the river morphology changes in the park, this is some flood-induced changes over 20 years along the Limpopo River. I'm just going to focus a bit on about 2 or 3 changes. If you look, there's imagery from about the 1980s, which is very coarse. I didn't add it here, but this bit here on the left was completely vegetated and green, and there were trees. And then after the 2000 flood, completely changed the morphology of the river as it then scoured in and meandered that way. 2013, trees started coming back on that little island, started growing nicely. In 2013, with the next flood, kind of got scoured away. And then it also made a new channel on the right-hand side over here, we just went completely straight down through that vegetated bit. 2017 was vegetated again nicely, and now post-flood 2026, it looks like we lost a bit of those riparian trees again. In terms of this little meander down here, after the 2000 floods, 2012, it was still there, but after the floods in 2013, it completely changed the course of the river. You can see there was a little management track straight over there, where it used to have access to park management and rangers, and that got completely washed away after the floods in 2013. And then again started with this, where it used to meander and now started going straight, started getting vegetated a bit, and it looked like it scoured away that vegetation again now after this 2026 flood. And then lastly, this last bit on the right-hand side, we had a nice vegetated bit where the river used to meander back in the early 2000s until the 2013 flood, when it just completely, the channel just went straight through that vegetated bit. It was still open, and then 2013 we had quite a lot of rain, carried on with that channel, and then again now in 2026. So there's certain changes that happens along the river channel as well. Now a bit into some of the post-flood activities in terms of relief and aid. So when this flood had hit, although there were some camps evacuated as a precautionary approach, there were still some camps that then got cut off because the roads were damaged. So the actual camps and the people that were elevated, they were safe, but access then became a problem. And then we also had some staff that were stranded in some camps, right, where they were then cut off. So that was one of our most urgent actions. And because that rain was so persistent, it made it really hard also for the helicopter to fly for like the first day or two. But as soon as there was access, we mobilized as fast as we could. And there was a number of staff members that were so critical in these activities so that we could get this emergency relief to staff. So the relief was provided both internally to staff, and this is staff both that work for SANParks and staff that work for concessions or for restaurants, etc., all staff, and then externally as well. So to communities that were affected outside the park as well. So yeah, there were a number of houses. Eddie did mention Bahula village specifically, which is along the Bahula river, small river, feed into the Klein Letaba, eventually feeds into the Groot Letaba. And you know, these pictures, especially the one on the bottom right with the baby, and you know, as a mom, this one really struck me because we had children of staff that in these camps that were cut off for a long time, that was running out of baby formula, out of nappies, etc. So yeah, when I saw a picture of the baby finally having a bottle of milk, it was, yeah, it's really, oh, it was heartwarming, but just showed how devastating the flood was. And this is just within our little window, our little narrow area of Kruger. And you think that there were hundreds, thousands of little kids like this that also, you know, were stranded. And yeah, these impacts are really, really severe. So yeah, this is just some pictures also of staff and rangers getting aid, and a lot of donations from civil society and the private sector as well. There really was an outpour of relief. In terms of recovery and repair, so in the interest of both conservation and commercial operations, storing the following is very critical. Access and connectivity. So this is both in terms of for commercial operations, so that camps can open, tourism can resume again, we can get back to operating how we usually do, and then also for conservation, for rangers to access areas, patrols, etc. So having no access and connectivity really is a major stumbling block. Then bulk infrastructure and services. So like I mentioned earlier, although camps might have been fine because they were elevated, the pumps for water is in the channel, in the river. So when those pumps get washed away, their camps, although they are fine, they don't have access to water. Same with electricity. What ended up happening is a lot of these camps would have generators. So fine, they'd be good for a couple of days. But then what happens is fuel then runs out from the garages at these camps. So restoring electricity was really, really important as well. And once again, these are just some pictures showing bridges that have washed away in the top over here. This is some emergency fixing of roads and causeways that were done. This picture over here of a rondavel or a hut in the Tabarescam shows a fridge that got lifted up by the water and completely wedged in the middle of the veranda. This is also some of the repair work done in and around Satara. These are some of the staff reconnecting electricity. And this is literally as soon as things were dry enough and people could access and get around, it was all hands on deck trying to get everything serviced and fixed again. Yeah, this is just windows that were broken. You can imagine the force of this current. This was at Shimoweni along the Letaba River. To actually have curtains, to actually get wedged like that within the bars of the windows. And it's really frightening to think that if there were people there, what could have happened? Roads being severely affected, getting the right machinery out there. This was a power line that got washed out that affected camps in the northern part of the park, multiple camps. So there was a need to get a helicopter to fly there to get the right poles and strap poles so that the technicians, etc., could reconnect everything. Yeah, it really was a crazy time. In terms of key lessons, I think what really stood out for me personally was the importance of a diverse and active disaster management committee in the park. So by diverse, I mean having everyone from hospitality, colleagues from the tourism sector, colleagues from technical services, our electricians, our bulk water service providers, etc., the rangers, conservation managers, having scientists as well in terms of keeping an eye on the weather, keeping an eye on the gauges along the river. That was completely important. And then also being a very active disaster management committee, we had daily meetings. On some days, we even had 2 meetings at a time, but we also had a WhatsApp group that was very active. We were lucky we had like 4 hours of silence in the middle of the night because you would get the last post at 2 a.m. in the morning about something, and the first post is at 4 o'clock in the morning again with someone posting the status of rivers and road connectivity. And then open communication between stakeholders across institutions. So, for example, our connection and communication between us and district municipalities outside the park, with Limcom through EDI, for example, and then just having this regional, international communication across borders was really imperative. We had comms with dam operators, down in the Nkomati catchment, in the Limpopo Basin catchment as well. So that when we saw this bulk of water coming through, us monitoring it, for us to already alert the stakeholders downstream as well across these boundaries. And like Edie mentioned, I fully agree the value of social media. In terms of what happened along the Olifants and the Letaba, the night before, people were already posting statuses, videos, etc., of flooded roads and bridges and rivers that you already knew this was what was in a certain catchment. So you could already anticipate what was on its way downstream. And then also these WhatsApp groups that allow for this communication. And then another lesson is definitely our blind spots in the park. There are certain parts where we do not have gauging stations along some of the rivers, which is major blind spots for us and something we would need to think about. How do we equip these areas of the park so that we can have a better forecasting and monitoring of these flooding events? And then also that during national disasters, like we just experienced now, civil society and the private sector are often keen and willing to assist. We really had an outpour of people wanting to assist, to donate, to volunteer, etc. And we do recognize that Kruger is a brand, right? So when this happened and there was media attention around Kruger, we realized that that brand is what kind of how people want to donate. And that's why when there was ample donations, we were able to share their donations beyond just the border of the park because we got so many aid and relief at the time. But I think what also speaks to this is that within 2 days, the ministry was able, and SANParks was able to set up this Kruger Recovery Fund. Because what we found ourselves dealing with as the Disaster Management Committee is while you're dealing with this disaster, people are trying to contact you from all sides because they want to help. And the best way to deal with that was to set up a specific recovery fund for that so that people could put any resources or funds that they wanted to into that, and so that can be managed separately. But this has really helped so that we as a disaster management committee could just focus on dealing with the disaster at the time, without having to still deal with endless emails and phone calls, etc., about people wanting to donate. So just having one pot where everyone could just share, and yeah, to just share their donations. Appreciation post the KNP Disaster Management Committee. Yeah, it was really all hands on deck. Our rangers, our hospitality staff, our colleagues on the ground, technical services. Yeah, it really was unprecedented in the sense not only the level of flood we were dealing with, but just that it was from the northern border to the southern border, east to west, all at the same time, over 2 million hectares. Keeping in mind that there are thousands of people within the park. And then SANParks honorary rangers, they were managing a lot of the donations as well and just coordinating all of that. Civil society and the private sector for the outpour from their side. And then of course Department of Water and Sanitation for the gauging stations and operating those, because those things really helped us have an eye on the ground as to what was happening in the rivers, both inside the park and outside as well. ISA Weather Services for their warnings. Yeah, it really helped us prepare. From my side, I think it was accurate when they said it was a level 9, level 10. It felt like level 9, level 10 on the ground. And then also for Limcom through Eddie, we worked very, very closely during this time. But yeah, just appreciation to everyone involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Trisha Stridom, who is the Senior Manager, Systems Ecology at SANParks. Thank you so much for that overview from the TFCA side, and we can already see these interlinkages from Eddie's presentation. I will open the floor for questions. I do know there were some that were put in the chat. Okimetse, maybe you could assist us with that.
Thank you a lot, Beauty. Not really questions, because I think Eddie has been doing quite a good job of already addressing some of the questions and comments. But what I can capture is there has already been discussions, very fantastic discussion ongoing on the side about joint communication, how miscommunication can be managed and realigned. Eddie did emphasize that there has already been some efforts to communicate with those with media on really what is happening on the ground and informing them. The use of AI. Madam Maruna has already asked about how do we see the use of AI in all of these systems, and Eddie has really alluded to already Limcom piloting that use of AI, and they're seeing quite good results across their systems. The other one was really generally around partnerships across all stakeholders, harmonization of systems, your DSS and other information management systems. Did we see them really rallying towards one goal, and how do we make sure that there is harmonization across different players? There is a good discussion going on around transboundary SOPs or agreements that will make response across borders be facilitated effectively and with ease. And already some solutions or ideas around how can that be facilitated, probably through introduction of DRR as a main priority within the TFCAs, and suggestion of review of SADC TFCA guidelines to make sure that is being already included there. And thanks also again, Madam Aruna, that to highlight that GLTFCA is already looking towards how can they develop some TFCAs that can make and facilitate that cross-border response. I think just to summarize, I think there's a lot of big discussions that are ongoing on the chat. Thank you.
Great,
Thank you, Richard.
thanks. Thanks, Onkemetsi. Do we have any other questions that colleagues online would like to ask? Please, you can raise your hand and we give you the opportunity to ask. Questions going once? Going twice?
There is one question around poaching. I don't know if we have somebody who can try to address it. Maybe Tasha. Somebody is asking, because of the devastation of infrastructure, how was the access for law enforcement, and did we see any poaching activities happening or rooming up because of taking advantage of the situation?
Yeah, that's a good question, completely valid question as well. Tricky to answer from our side because we can't really always give stats on poaching data. But as you can imagine, during the floods, access was limited, both inside the park, but even for poachers to access the park, right? Everyone was dealing with the flood across the entire area. But as one would expect, considering that people's livelihoods would have been severely affected by this flood, you can imagine that the pressure put on people to survive at this point would be greater. So we can definitely anticipate that this may become a problem. But yeah, getting access to these areas so that our law enforcement officers can get into all these areas is really important. But this is also where our aerial support, our use of our helicopters, our fixed wing drones, etc., do still become very, very handy in this regard. Thank you.
Thanks so much. There's an appreciation post also, I think, from Aruna. Thank you to all for the efforts to avert loss of life. I was also reminded in terms of Eddie's presentation on the institutional framework about this early warning system, how even the local structures are quite critical. I in my previous experience as a hydrologist in the Zambezi, I remember there was an early warning system that was put up. Gauge readers in these stations were then armed with phones that would, once the sensor reached above a certain threshold, then there would be these texts that would be sent. And what you had was, because these are gauge readers that live within the communities, they were then the ones that would trigger the traditional, the local community early warning system. Because I mean, it's all hands on deck. So through their traditional systems, to the headman and the chief, they would then have what they are usually used to in terms of announcements and the like, for warning the communities that were there. Unfortunately, I think the system now is non-functional because of issues of maintenance. But yeah, it reminded me of that and how important the local community and the traditional leadership can be in such. Okay, we do seem to have exhausted our questions, and I notice I think the discussions are still underway in the chat. But I think what we will then do now is switch over to look at this online training, the presentation and launch of the training course on mainstreaming DRM or risk-informed development into TFCA. I know we've got two presenters, Paul and Colum. I was advised that Colum, you would, I think, start and introduce and then allow Paul to take over. So Colum, over to you. Colum is the SADC TFCA advisor, and you can basically just introduce to us and let us know a bit more, give us a bit more information on what this online training course is.
All right. Thank you so much, Madam Moderator, and good afternoon to colleagues. Yeah, I think the discussion so far very critical to our cause. I really would want to firstly recognize the recent disasters that happened in South Africa, that happened in Mozambique, and some other parts of the SADC member states. And really, our hearts are with those that were affected. And I think again that actually allows us to think deep and say the issues to do with TFCAs are not only limited to conservation of wildlife, are not only limited to conservation of habitats. It is actually a thing about many things that are happening that are in our space. To look into issues to do with water, as has been discussed, to look into issues to do with infrastructure, as has been discussed, energy, and I think most critical again is the issues to do with food, where production systems and everything really or have been really devastated by these occurrences, these disasters. And I was also agitated to think that how often are these disasters going to happen? Are we only going to be facing disasters in the mode of floods, or any other disasters are going to affect our landscape? So given that, I think it is imperative, again, from the discussions that we got here, we have participation of people from different organizations, different entities, different sectors coming together, realizing the importance of the challenge that we have. And again, that really allows us to think through in terms of then how do we integrate issues of risk reduction into the programming of TFCAs. How do we inform TFCA programming in the face of these disasters? And I think that's the nuance of the next discussion, where we really want to look into these challenges. We really want to look into how do we capacitate our institutions, how do we capacitate individuals when we are faced with these disasters at large. So I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah, this was just to explain that it is not only the Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources Directorate that is involved. There's a multi-sectoral approach, given that the challenge that we are facing is affecting a lot of people, many sectors, and that we really need to come together in terms of our approaches, in terms of our policies, and actions on the ground, as has been presented by the previous presenters. You can move to the next slide. Yes, so again, what does it mean to have the TFCA program? What does it mean to also incorporate disaster risk reduction, and obviously to have our program having a risk-informed development, where we really want to integrate these issues that we are discussing today in the development of our TFCAs. Do we have information which is lacking? How are disasters mainstreamed in the program and all related? But central to our thinking is that risk reduction has to be central in the development of TFCAs, as has been seen with the challenges that we have been facing, and the possibilities of collaboration, the possibilities of cooperating from different angles with different sectors. We can move to the next. This is just to also highlight the partners that we are working together with at the Secretariat in the effort to really mainstream and have risk reduction as part of the TFCA programming. And I think those are the different partners that we have: Joint Action Nature Africa program, and many other programs that we might have that are not listed here, that are making efforts, even private sector, even individuals that we are working with, that have been active on the ground to avert the disasters that we are talking of today. We can move to the next. So mainstreaming risk reduction into our system, into our program, I think is key. Is the presentations that we have seen so far are actually leading towards that thinking that we really need to have risk reduction and risk-informed development as part of our programming, and as well. And again, thanks to the support that we are getting from the government of federal government of Germany in supporting this endeavor. You can move to the next. So, given all that, the thinking going forward is that we really have to develop and operationalize a web-based training program on risk reduction and risk-informed development. And to this end, we have made efforts through the support that I mentioned, through the German government, to develop a course not only to react to, but also to be proactive to the challenges that we have been facing and that we are facing and that we are obviously going to be facing in the future. And taking us through that bit is Paul, whom we have been working with in that development. So I will hand over to Paul to take us through the next bits. So Paul, please.
Thanks, Colm. Yes, we're responding today to events that recently took place, a flood event that affected one of the TFCAs. But these disasters do happen. They happen across, and it's not just floods. There's also droughts, there's wildfire, there are disease risks. There's quite a few possible threats and possible disasters that can affect the TFCAs. And looking at how to prepare for them is really what the whole approach to DRR and TFCA development has been looking at. This key activity was specifically asked to develop a short web-based training, a course that can provide insight into the multi-sectoral, the multi-hazard, as well as the multidisciplinary approach to address this. So what we did is we developed a short course with TFCA practitioners as well as disaster risk reduction experts to put together a short web-based training that can be used by practitioners in the field to broaden understanding, to show linkages, and to provide good reference information, and in that way start addressing or at least introducing the concepts and building it into the various systems that exist within TFCAs. So the disaster risk reduction and risk informed development short course has been built. This is just the opening component of it. It has been built within a story map component, using story maps within the Esri suite of options. And this is embedded within the regional expert or the web portal for SADC based in Kenya that we have been working with to actually host this. So there is a short course. There's a link that will be shared with you after this, which takes you directly to the story map that you can work through on your own time. It takes about an hour to work through the entire short course, to look at some of the components and to broaden your understanding. The story map is broken up into 6 parts. There's an introduction leading into the first chapter, which is all around understanding the disaster risk reduction and risk-informed development concepts, because there's quite a wide suite of definitions, ideas, thoughts, processes, understanding. And the presenters before me have alluded to certain of the components around building back better. There's preparation. There's understanding the difference between a threat and a risk and an actual disaster. Then there's chapter 2 looks at the TFCAs, looks at the protected areas and the role they play, the network, how this fits together. Chapter 3 looks at how these, can you integrate disaster risk reduction and risk-informed development into sustainable development, the various policies and planning. The 4th chapter looks specifically at nature-based solutions within TFCAs and how these can contribute to disaster risk reduction, because we believe these large landscapes, these protected areas, these transboundary areas have got a massive contribution to reduce the risks and to reduce the threats if we include the components within risk-informed development, that we are aware of how they can work and what they can actually do. The conclusion to the short course really just wraps it up in terms of broadening your knowledge, sharing the information, creating a community of practice, or that you become part of within the SADC TFCA network that Steve is in charge of, but that whole component so that we can actually have multiple role players and actors.
I think Colum, maybe you could mute your mic.
Yeah. The actual content of each of those individual chapters is broken down into various texts, just for introduction, for reading that you can scan through quickly. There's a lot of graphics that show and illustrate the various components. There are deep dives with videos and links to the key documents required, the various international protocols, SOPs, best practice, various knowledge documents, and also under broadening understanding of TFCAs. There's various videos and links to them. And then each chapter ends with a self-evaluation for you to look, test, put in your answers and reveal model answers to that, to help you broaden the understanding of this actual concept and idea and how they can work together. The question has been asked, who is this short course for, and who should actually work their way through it? Who should look at it? Who should build it in? And the simple answer is for you as a practitioner, and it's for your colleagues within the conservation sector, which many of you within the SADC TFCA network and that attend these webinars are involved with. But it's also for other sectors, such as the specialists in disaster risk reduction, in agriculture, fisheries, forestry, planning departments, as well as emergency response. Tarsha mentioned the linkages between the various role players and people that actually work together in an emergency response. it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. There are structures, there are networks, there are linkages, there are protocols, how these all work together. So the short course is really for anybody that's involved in conservation or TFCA planning, that's looking at the preparation component and how these early warning systems work. How do they get incorporated into the TFCA structures? How do you actually build this into response? There were practical examples coming out of the examples today about how the information coming from upstream reached the TFCA or Kruger Park in this response, and how the information was then fed downstream to stakeholders in preparation for the flood that was on its way. But it could also be drought, it could also be wildfires, it could be diseases, it could be transboundary disease, animal diseases. There's many aspects that we can address within these disasters and threats that are faced. The course is around a building around the cross-sectoral nature. It looks at the interdisciplinary to broaden your knowledge either as a conservationist about what DRR is or conversely. And it also looks at the multi-hazard approach, that often these aspects run hand in hand, that deluge follows drought, that the multi-hazards, that we have terrible drought conditions and then we have floods. If we have terrible drought conditions, then we could have massive fires. So there are various components around the multi-hazard that is shown and discussed, and how to prepare for them and how we can build these into the TFCA structures. This is an introductory course. It gives a good understanding. It broadens the awareness, but it's really going to be the onus of the TFCA structures and of the network through the community of practice that exists to actually build this and take it further. So the link will be provided to you. It's a simple hyperlink, story map, DRR and RRD mainstreaming in TFCAs. It takes you directly through to the course where you can just enter your information, work the way through the course, play around with the self-evaluation questions, look at the model answers, and share their own opportunities through the network to actually share with the links and use this information much wider within the TFCA fields. It is a start. It is a process of aligning, but I think we'll be able to achieve some good results in building this interdisciplinary linkage that is required if we're going to address the TFCA and maximize on the full extent of what the TFCAs can do to reduce risk and build this information into our preparation and into the systems. The examples that Tasha used today really shows how early warning, how preparation, how decisions actually could save lives. But this will have to go wider. This will have to be built into the upstream and downstream context of the TFCAs and the areas that surround them, because that's the only way we'll be able to achieve full success. So there are opportunities that you can raise questions, you can discuss that, and we can assist and help with the course as it develops, to embed it, to share it with your practitioners so we can take it further. Thank you. Beauty, over to you.
Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks so much, Colum. Do we have any questions regarding the training course and the aspects that have been brought out, especially by Paul? So the link is in the chat for those of you interested. Do we have any questions?
I see Marcus, who was also involved with the development of this, has made a comment on the sequence of land degradation, drought and wildfires, followed by flooding, that deluge follows drought. So it's quite nice. I don't know, Marcus, if you would like to elaborate on that.
Yes, please, Marcus.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, just to just reiterate, the risk is interconnected. It's a systemic, multidimensional risk. can't be addressed by any one single actor on their own. So it has to be a much more integrated, holistic response to this. And this means that we need to stop separating out disasters from development and recognize that these issues and therefore it's about understanding the risk, not just risk to our development. So we tend to understand risk as a way to, as a threat to our development processes. We also need to understand risk within development and get much better at understanding it's not just about risk to development, it's about understanding risk within development. And therefore, how do we shift our development pathways to one which is much more resilient and sustainable and doesn't create the same level of risk, exposure, vulnerability, and hazards as well. So the hydrology of our systems is related to the ecology of our systems. So we need to get much better at working across these compartmentalized policies and we tend to have a DRR framework, we have a development framework, we have a climate adaptation framework, we have a climate mitigation framework. So these are all different parts of the problem. The challenge is, how do we connect the different parts in a holistic way? And of course, it coalesces at that local level, at the community base, in the way that we use our land, the way that we recognize the values of ecosystem services. It all kind of interconnects through. So it's much more about systems thinking. And if we can do that, as much as we talk about cascading impacts, we can also get cascading and compounding benefits. It ticks the social economic box, it ticks the DRR box, it ticks the climate change box, it ticks the net biodiversity gains box. So it's about turning this on its head, just seeing not just the risk as a threat, but also as an opportunity to transition to a more sustainable development paradigm. I stop there.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Marcus. Paul, you've posted a link in the chat.
Yeah. That's a link to use to get to the story map, which is the short course, online short course. So it is available. It is live within the SADC portal.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, colleagues, I think we slowly winding down. If there are no other questions and points of clarification, I will then invite Steve, I think, to come and wrap up and do the closing. Steve?
Great. Thank you, Beauty. Thank you for facilitating. This was a fascinating, a bit scary. See some of the images from the great Limpopo system, but really, I think also exciting to see the collaboration that's happening. The early warning systems are working. The degree to which the flooding and the event was fascinating to see when we thought 2013 was big, or some of the others. So it shows we actually don't really know. We're going to have to go beyond number 10 now, as was mentioned. So thank you for all the participants, the presenters, as well as the people who were watching and listening. I just want to say that I have posted in the chat the next webinar the TFCA network will be hosting. Will be looking at the issue of gender. And I'm sure even if we look at this disaster, one can look at it through a gender lens and see the impact in particular on women who perhaps are farmers, who are less able to respond quickly because they're dealing with children, etc. So we want to have a look at how can we, in these transfrontier conservation areas, start talking about rather than gender inclusion, gender transformation. What can conservation do to create a more equal society, equal relationships across the conservation sector, be it from the human wildlife conflict issues to employment, etc. So on the 10th of March, we will be hosting a webinar. You're welcome to join. We will share the link also on the WhatsApp group. Please join us for that discussion. It will also be fascinating and as important. So with that, Onkemesi and others, thank you for organizing this. Thank you for joining. Have a good day further.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to everyone for taking the time out to join us as we were looking at the DRR side and the early warning system, especially with a focus on the Limpopo and the GL TFCA. That being said, I wish you a very successful rest of the day and the week, and yeah, all the best.
Thank you a lot, Beauty.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you,
team.
bye.
Thank you.